Afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about the state of the Australian economy. Debt is at an all-time high. Wages have stalled. Housing is now more unaffordable than ever. We have an underemployment problem. We have more part-timers than ever before, and there's no full-time work. And automation is just around the corner. These are but a few of a multitude of problems facing our economy at the moment. And yesterday, an ex-RBA board member, John Edwards, indicated that there could be 8 rate rises over the next 2 years. Now that's on average, if you put on average 0.25% rate rise every quarter from the RBA, that means a 2% rate rise at the end of 2 years. All the while, the economy grew in the March quarter by just 0.3%. What does this mean for people? Well, households are already being squeezed. As I mentioned, wages are flatlined, in fact declining in real terms. Retail spending is down. Household debt is at an all-time high. So where do people have the money if a 2% rate rise was to occur? People are already spending more than they earn. Not to mention the massive increases in electricity and gas prices. Just tomorrow, there's going to be a 20% increase in your electricity bill. And how are they supposed to pay for that and have a 2% rate rise over the next 2 years? Well, to be honest, I don't think we're going to see a 2% rate rise, because I don't believe the economy is strong enough to have a rate rise at all, let alone 8 rate rises over the next 2 years. But that's not for me to decide, that's for the RBA to decide. But this all means that people have less money in their pockets for discretionary spending, and therefore less demand for products that businesses now sell. An interest rate rise could be detrimental to our economy, considering where we're at. People are under mortgage stress. As I mentioned, wages aren't going anywhere. People aren't spending any money in retail. And our gas and electricity prices are going through the roof. So what does that leave us? Default. People end up defaulting on their mortgages. The property bubble bursts. Banks start tightening their screws. And the flow-on domino effect leads to people out of work. And then the big R word, recession, of which we haven't had since 1991. So this leaves very little room to move for policymakers, and in particular the RBA. The RBA board can't particularly raise interest rates because they'll risk bursting the property bubble. And at the same time, they can't risk cutting interest rates either, because that would only fuel more towards the property bubble, increase it, make it worse. So the RBA is stuck between a rock and a hard place. And the government can do very little either. If there were to be a recession, there will be no $1,000 handouts like former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd gave us all out and said, go forth and spend. There'd be none of that because debt is at an all-time high. We can't afford it. And in the event of a global economic downturn, we are going to face serious problems. Because, as I mentioned, the RBA then could maybe cut rates back to 0 from 1.5% cash rate. But it's going to be very little if we end up having another GFC like we did in 2008. And then the government, if they came in, there's no money for a stimulus package. The best they could do is probably fast-track infrastructure. And that, in turn, would probably all up lead to Australia being in a deep recession. But what I don't understand is, this is the shape of our economy, and the government wants to give away $60 billion in a corporate tax cut. And as I said, debt's at an all-time high, but they want to give $60 billion away to corporations in the name of jobs and growth, so to speak. Well, I'm going to outline why jobs and growth is a failed trickle-down economic theory by Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison. The idea of this trickle-down economic theory is that if they give $60 billion tax cut to business, business can then expand their operations, employ more staff by creating jobs and growth. But the problem is, it's back to front. Because with trickle-down economic theory, it works like a pyramid in their theory. Water coming down a pyramid, so it trickles down and everybody eventually gets a slice of the growth in the economy. But the problem with this is they're not generating the demand needed for business to expand and employ. Because if there's no consumer demand for a product or service, then there's no need for the business to supply that product or service. And right now, with wages flatlined, people under mortgage stress, retail spending at an all-time low, people don't have the money and aren't going out and buying products or services. Not discretionary-wise anyway. They're spending on things they need, necessities for their household, so they can live. They're paying for power and water and phone and internet and everything like that. But they're not going out there and using their money for discretionary spending purposes. And this is why I say the theory is flawed. Because if you don't have the demand, business can't create the supply. They can't create the supply, therefore they can't expand and employ. Without demand, you have nothing. So what they would have been better off doing, Malcolm Turnbull and Treasurer Scott Morrison, would actually have been to, at the last election, come forth with a policy and say we'll give income tax cuts. Simply because the fact is that those income tax cuts would then mean that people have a little bit more money in their pockets to go out for discretionary spending and go and spend some money somewhere and encourage business to then expand and employ staff, because all of a sudden there's a bit more demand there to do it. And that's why I say it's back to front. And I'm going to add this. Back in the GFC, now according to Prime Minister Turnbull and Treasurer Scott Morrison, $60 billion in tax cuts will create jobs and growth. Why is it then that in 2008 during the GFC, the then Prime Minister Rudd and then Treasurer Wayne Swan, in their stimulus package, gave out $1,000 to everyone and said, go forth and spend? Why did they do it? And it worked. So if that worked, why is the government giving a $60 billion tax cut to big business? Because imagine if Kevin Rudd and Wayne Swan during the GFC came out and said, you know what, we'll give out $1,000 to every business to go out there and expand and employ to create jobs and growth. It's the same thing. But the thing is, during the GFC there was no demand because people had no money. The world was in the grips of a recession. Luckily Australia managed to avoid it. And it was a lot to do with that stimulus package of $1,000 to every person to go out and spend. Kevin Rudd and Wayne Swan were creating the demand in order for business to generate the supply and expand and employ staff and keep staff in jobs, and therefore avoiding a recession. So you can see that the trickle-down economic concept, or Turnbullnomics, is actually comes back from the 1980s of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. But it's a failed theory because it doesn't generate the demand that is needed for business to create the supply. So with that, I'll leave you. I wish you a good afternoon and have a think about it. Thank you. Cheers.